Last week, Peter showed us that God is giving us a new identity together as his special people to show him in the world. And he finished by showing that we have all been made free because God has purchased us as his redeemed people. In this passage, Peter addresses those Christians who are still living in actual slavery. So what's the go with that? Why does Peter simply talk about it like it's normal for them? Why isn't he telling them that they shouldn't be putting up with this or defending their human rights? Now, it's important for us to note that slavery was a normal part of the world that Peter was writing to. In fact, it's likely that a majority of the population were slaves. Now, this is pretty foreign to us, but it was a fundamental aspect of the society that they lived in. Basically, instead of having business owners and employees, they had householders and slaves. Each house was its own business. The householder was the CEO, the family were the top-level management and sales executives, and the rest of the household was made up of slaves in varying levels of hierarchy. And for most slaves, their lives were entirely dependent on the household. They got their food, their clothing, their housing, and even their social standing from the house that they were a part of. But they had no freedom. They were entirely at the mercy of their householder, and they could be bought and sold as the householder wished. They had no control over being part of a house that treated them well or a house that treated them badly. It's worth remembering that this was a pre-Christian world that Peter was writing to. Only a very small minority of the population was Christian, and the majority had never even heard of Jesus, let alone a Christian view of ethics. For Peter to encourage slaves to defend their rights in this culture and fight for their freedom would have been a death sentence to most of these people. But in case we can start to think that Christianity is about bringing moral reform to our world, then we need to remember that some of the most devout Christian societies that we have seen in history actually use passages like this to support their own practice of slavery. Peter knows that the only way to transform culture is to transform people. The only way to transform people is to transform their hearts. And the only one who can transform our hearts is Jesus. And so he points us to Jesus' example. Jesus didn't insist on his rights and fight back against the unjust and corrupt system. Instead, he willingly submitted himself to abuse, to corrupt judges, to disinterested rulers and fickle crowds. Why? Because he was entrusting himself to the one who judges justly. And that's why Peter insists that if we suffer, we need to make sure that we are suffering for doing good. It's easy to excuse doing evil if you know you're going to get in trouble anyway. But the way that we endure unjust suffering is by entrusting ourselves to God, the just judge. Peter even goes as far as saying that this is what we have been called to do, to follow Christ's example in our own suffering. This doesn't mean that we seek out ways to suffer, but it does mean that Christ has given us the pattern for how to endure suffering faithfully. But I think the most important encouragement for enduring unjust sufferings is the final reminder that Christ went through his sufferings for us. It was our sin that he carried to the cross. It was our suffering that he endured. It was our death that he died, so that we could instead live a life of righteousness. And he has opened the way for us to return to the one who protects and guards us in all our trials.